It's like always quicker than I think it's going to be. We'll see. I think we're live. I don't know why I always sing as we're about to go live.
We had a lot to.
Live with Shannon.
I think we are live with Shannon. Okay, so before we intro Shannon and get her started with this presentation, Lisa's going to do the lovely job of housekeeping.
It's the best. We just want to say hi. First of all, I'm Lisa. This is Sarah. We are co-sponsors of SLP Summit along with Marisha from SLP Now. Before we get started with the course and the fun stuff, we want to go over all of the housekeeping to make sure that you understand that you can earn ASHA seats for a 10 course. There are just some strict guidelines you have to follow. So to earn the ASHA CE, you have to pay registration fee, which covers all of the courses within this active summit. You're going to want to watch the video, give your feedback, pass the quiz, and then at the end, you'll see a form. You confirm all of your details and actually opt in. And you want to do this for every course that you attend in Summit. If you don't click that opt-in button, then you won't get to earn ASHA CEUs. It won't be sent to the registry. So just check on all of your courses, all of those green check marks under each course that you've attended. Even if you don't want to earn ASHA CEUs, you can download a certificate for CMHs, which is what, if you track your own hours, that's all you need to do for of getting those hours for your certification interval for. So our replays will be at 26th, but you'll have until the 31st to submit all of your stuff for ASHA. We can't extend that. We can't change that. So make sure that if you have any questions, email us before that date. So let's go.
Okay, let's do this.
So boring.
I'm so excited. I get to do the fun part, which is to introduce our very good friend, Shannon. We are so excited that she is going to be doing this presentation tonight. We already are very familiar with her work. And so we've wanted to have her for a long time. We're really fortunate that Lisa and I both got to spend 10 whole days with Shannon in Ghana this summer. And she did a lot of work with those children with AAC and some of the different core boards and things she has made. And she did presentations for the staff and families. And so right then we were like, you have to do this presentation for everybody or something like it. And so somehow we managed to convince her to come on and share this with all of you. Shannon is from Wisconsin and is an SLP that has worked in a variety of settings, including outpatient and preschool. Most recently was middle school. And a lot of you probably know her familiar face. She is the creator of Speechy Musings, where she produces not only amazing materials, but also blog posts and other things. And so definitely check that out if you haven't yet, which I'm sure you all have. And she also has a really amazing Instagram feed that's where we first met Shannon and fell in love with her. And so we're super excited to turn this time over to her so that she can talk to us about all things AAC.
Perfect. Hello, everyone. Thanks for the warm welcome, Sarah. I was just going to introduce myself, but I think Sarah kind of covered it. I'm super, super excited to be here and honored to be here with all the other presenters. I'm going to be sharing evidence-based strategies for successful AAC implementation with you today. So I just have a few disclosures. As Sarah said, I have a blog and a social media and a website under the name Speechy Musings. I receive compensation for therapy materials purchased in my Teachers Pay Teachers store or TPT store under that same name. I also sell an AAC Implementation Toolkit, and I'll be showing several pages from that during this presentation. So first things first, what is AAC implementation? So typically when you're implementing an AAC device, these are all the steps you'll follow. So you would identify AAC needs in a student, then you would proceed to an evaluation where you might assess different devices or different systems. Then you will obtain or make the system if it's a low-tech system. And then comes AAC implementation. So I think sometimes, at least for me, just getting the device seems like such a hurdle and obstacle that it's like, once you get one, you're like, now what do I do? So when I say AAC implementation, I just mean that last stage, whatever you do after you get the system. And our focus during this phase is how we can make it as successful of a tool as possible for that student. So in this session, we're going to discuss common AAC implementation barriers. And when I say that, I just mean the things that make AAC systems fail, or the things that make students and families and teams abandon them. I'll also describe the three-pronged approach for evidence-based AAC implementation. I'll identify 4 foundational skill areas that you need to teach communication partners, and I will share some implementation tips along the way. I also want to just clarify, when I say AAC, I mean everything, or pretty much all of the different aided AAC systems. So I'm just going to share general principles that you should be able to apply no matter what AAC system or device you're using, whether it's an app on an iPad or a pod book or a core board, or even like a high-tech device like a Dynavox. So a quick introduction. Sarah did a really great one. This is more going to be my AAC history and kind of how it led me to doing this research and being really invested in figuring out what worked. So I came into the field really, really excited about AAC. When I applied to grad school, it was one of the things that I was most excited about. I really wanted to do a lot of work with AAC when I graduated. I was one of the lucky SLPs who actually felt like I learned a lot about AAC in grad school. And still, when I graduated, I got my first job in an outpatient clinic and reality hit. And I was in charge of leading implementation across families, entire teams, and support systems. And I just remember feeling like it was super daunting and super overwhelming as a new grad. And I felt like I was often spinning my wheels, and I was just revamping my approach. Like every month or so, I'd be like, this is what I'm going to do. And it just felt like there was constant change. I didn't have a direction or an aim. So that need for consistency for the long haul during AAC implementation was something I felt like wasn't talked about enough. A few years ago, I switched to the schools and saw AAC implementation from a whole different angle. And I started to understand the whole village that it took to make AAC implementation successful. So all during this time, as Sarah said, I create materials for SLPs. I love creating materials. So of course, my brain, I was just thinking of like, what is an AAC curriculum I could make, or what material could I create to help this problem, to help the overwhelm. So I started creating bins with different core vocabulary words, and I put materials in each of them. I was just kind of creating all these different core word materials. And then I had a therapy moment that made me realize a few things that I was doing right that seemed to have a bigger impact than just creating therapy materials for me and my team. So at the time, I was working in a middle school with an AAC user. And those of you in middle school might, actually everyone hopefully will appreciate this story, but we're on the way back to class and he bolted from me. And long story short, he ended up on top of one of our school's vending machines. So he's perched up on the vending machine, and I immediately put the device on the ground. You know, I'm like just trying to get him down. And at that time, another one of my AAC users happened to be going by in the hallway with a paraprofessional. So the other student, of course, is looking up at my student on the vending machine and just hysterically laughing. If you can imagine 2 middle schoolers just in the hallway, he's pointing. He is just thinking this is the funniest thing he's ever seen. So without skipping a beat, the paraprofessional started laughing and just began modeling on the other student's device. So she said things like, what do you think about that? And she said, look, and funny. And she's just chatting away about my student on the vending machine. And I felt like that moment stuck with me afterwards. And I thought about it for a long time. And I thought about what this para did or knew that others didn't. And I reflected maybe on her mindset a lot. And I started to reflect on what I had done right to create that moment and what I could do to create more moments like that for all of the other students on my caseload. One realization I had was how important it is to get the whole team on board and excited about AAC. So shortly after that, I kind of moved on from trying to find an AAC curriculum or looking for new AAC materials, and I really wanted to focus on what mattered. So we're going to start with some problems first. So AAC abandonment rates are really, really high. I read a ton of studies, and it says as many as 75% of high-tech devices are unused. So of course I needed to know what was causing this, and more importantly, what could I do to make an impact with the reality of our jobs, which is limited time and limited resources. So what I really wanted to avoid was going through all of those steps that I outlined, like identifying needs for a student, going through a whole assessment, realizing AAC is a really valuable tool for this student, and then having it all be abandoned. It felt like a waste of time on my part, and it felt like kind of like I was building up the student and family to think that this was going to be a really great tool, and then just having it all kind of collapse. So when I started looking at research, I realized there's actually been quite a bit of research on AAC implementation barriers. And they point to these factors as some of the biggest barriers. So the research mentions barriers like a lack of access to an AAC system, which means it's just not with the student when it needs to be. Limited communicative interactions or opportunities, so the student isn't being given times to use the device to interact with other people. Unrealistic expectations of communication partners and whole teams, limited training or AAC knowledge of the team, and a poor match between the AAC device, the child, and the family. And all the studies that I'm going to cite are linked, as you can see, it's kind of at the bottom of the slide, and I have all the resources at the end. So I definitely saw all of these difficulties firsthand, and personally, none of this research surprised me. Maybe you feel the same way, maybe you've seen all of this in person too. So when I began digging into the research, this is what it kind of said. These are the 4 themes that I saw again and again. So they were that families really need to be involved in this process, that AAC overwhelm is really real and needs to be accounted for in our interventions, that early wins are important, and that educating others should probably take up the majority of our time and energy, at least in the beginning of AAC implementation. So I could probably list 100 different barriers and probably 100 different things that the research says to do about all of these barriers. But I don't want to spend too long on them because every person I know who works in AAC sees these all and experiences them. We're here to solve them. But what I tried to do was really dwindle down what I needed to do into the most important elements. Like it says on this slide, a big factor I kept seeing again and again and again in my research and just online in my community was overwhelm. So I knew right away that an important part of intervention and implementation is going to be sticking to what's most important. So here's how I want you to think about the information for the rest of the presentation. We're going to use the 80-20 rule. Some of you might have heard of this before. If you haven't, it's a time management tool for how you choose priorities. So I love using this in all different areas of my life. And in general, it just means that 80% of your output is generated by 20% of the input. So in other words, about 20% of your efforts or the things you do to create change are responsible for about 80% of the results or the change. So if you think about when you're cleaning your house, 20% of the work or those tasks that you might do when you're having guests over and you scramble to do right before the guests come over, that probably accounts for about 80% of the difference in the look and the cleanliness of your house. So if you're anything like me, you might have seen that last slide where we talk about what the research says, and you might see something that says like families need to be involved more. And you might think, well, I need to be sending carryover work home. I need to email more. I'm going to start a newsletter. And you might be thinking of different things that you could do and so on and so on. So the reality is that most of us are really overwhelmed, and it's not just with AAC. And this is, in my opinion, why it's so important to know that 20% for AAC implementation. So what are the 20% of things we could do that would make 80% of the progress or 80% of the success? So I want to avoid thinking about everything we could do and instead be focusing on those parts that will make the biggest overall impact. So to do this, we can't get distracted by shiny objects, which is hard for me, or constant new things, or worry about perfection. So because I can't share everything about AAC implementation in 1 hour, even though I talk really fast, which maybe you've realized already, it's my goal to just share that 20% with you. So I hope that this presentation helps to narrow down ideas for your AAC implementation and just make clear what you should be focusing on. So without further ado, these are what I consider to be the 3 prongs of AAC success. So these are the things that we as SLPs are responsible for managing and running. And it seemed like most AAC research fell into one of these 3 categories. So the 3 prongs are family-centered intervention practices, direct instruction strategies, and communication partner training. So I think that when many SLPs think of improving their AAC therapy or their knowledge, they might only think of that middle category or the direct instruction strategies, so how they can improve their own therapy. But there's two huge pieces of the AAC implementation puzzle that you'd miss by just focusing on your own therapy strategies and techniques. So I believe that these are the three areas we need to be making priorities and splitting our time between in order to make our AAC implementation most effective. So next up, I'm just going to go through each of these fairly quickly and share some of my favorite tidbits and quotes from research on each of them. So first up is family-centered intervention practices. And this simply means that you're working collaboratively with the family and providing support and education to the entire family unit. You're not just working with a student or child. So I hear this term a lot in the early intervention world, but I think it's just as important in the AAC world. Attitude here is everything. So I just think it's so important that you get family buy-in, because if families don't see the value in an AAC system or it doesn't fit their needs, it will be so much more difficult to get used, taught, valued, or reinforced at home. So whenever possible, use family-centered intervention practices. I love this quote from a research article because I think it summarizes what family-centered intervention looks like really well. So we should be focused on giving the family choices, building off of strengths, staying in really close communication, and focusing on individual family needs. So when I think about family-centered intervention, I try to be mindful of family culture and home language, and I try to write really functional goals that are motivating for the family. And I also work directly with the family in selecting relevant and important vocabulary to program in and teach. At the end of this presentation, I'm going to share a link, and in that link will be all the links that I mentioned in here. And one of them will be a free questionnaire that I use to do this. And I know many SLPs use surveys like this to gather vocabulary when they're initially setting up an AAC system. But I recommend sharing the survey with families maybe every year or at least every 3 years during the reevaluation in schools, just to make sure everything's up to date on the device, that new interests are accounted for, and any family member changes are accounted for, and everything's just generally up to date. So the biggest thing I personally focus on for family-centered intervention is teaching the family how to embed the AAC system within activities they're already doing. So how can the system fill a need that they already have with their child? A different research article says that the more severe a child's disability is, the more families focus on self-care and the less time that they report that they have to work on communication. So to me, this just increases the importance of including AAC in things that they're already doing and trying not to give them more to do. So the second prong of AAC success is direct instruction strategies, and direct instruction strategies are how we teach AAC in therapy. And they're what I think, like I said earlier, I think most of us think of this when we think of improving our AAC therapy or improving anything professionally. We think of what we're doing in therapy. So here are a few things I focus on for my direct instruction strategies. So I try to think about AAC therapy just like language therapy, just with an AAC system, which we'll talk a little bit more about later. And again, like I said earlier, I focus on programming and teaching really functional, motivating, meaningful, child-specific words. And I try to make my therapy super, super fun and really motivating. So the top direct instruction strategy that's been supported by research is aided language input. Everything I read in research seems to support that aided language input is, and I call this modeling throughout, the term will kind of change around, but this is the foundation of AAC implementation success. I love this quote from a meta-analysis that was done by O'Neill, Light, and Pope on the effects of modeling during intervention studies. So it just says that AAC interventions that included aided AAC input or modeling, either by itself or part of lots of other parts of their intervention, were found to be highly effective. And this was true across different ages, disabilities, and language skills, which is fantastic to see. So from this study, we know that modeling is a very, very important direct instruction strategy for AAC. This is another quote from the same study, and you can see several of their evidence-based direct instruction strategies for AAC here. I love this quote because I think it hands you the 20% for direct instruction strategies. So these are the most important things to include in effective AAC interventions. So like I kind of said earlier, there are a million different things we could do in therapy with our AAC users, but this study narrows it down to the most important components. So this meta-analysis looked at 28 case studies or research studies that included over 200 individuals who use AAC and concluded this. The things most likely included in highly effective intervention studies were things like expectant delays, effective direct prompting, asking open-ended questions, and providing contingent responses to what the student says. So here's one example of what this might look like in therapy, but this is really open-ended. So let's say you're working or you're playing with a car and a ramp. And hopefully in this scenario, the student's very motivated by cars or ramps. So you might start by asking an open-ended question like, what should we do next while holding the car? Then you provide a really long expectant delay. So ask that open-ended question and then wait for a long time and way longer than you're comfortable with. So I usually have a number in mind like 15, and I try to count really slowly to 15 because it can feel really long, but you need to account for that processing time. So open-ended question, really long expectant delay. If they don't respond, you could pull out their system. I just have a low-tech board to kind of show, but you could pull out their system and say, it looks like you want the car to go, and point to go on the system while you say that. If the student says anything on the device during this time, you just respond to what they said. That's those contingent responses. So if they say up, you put the car really high up in the air, or you might put it up on the ramp. If they say book or something totally unrelated, I run and grab a book. I show them what that word means and how people will respond or think about that word. If they don't respond at all, I might just pull out the AAC system again, and I would model go, and then just roll the car down the ramp to make it go, to show the power of the word go. So from that example, you might be thinking that this sounds an awful lot like regular old language therapy with young children learning how to use language. And like I said earlier, that's exactly how I like to think about it. So it's just language therapy plus modeling in a language that the student can respond in, so on their AAC system. So these are students that we determined that at times, or all of the time, it can be very difficult for them to respond verbally. So we're just giving them a different way to respond. But beyond that, it's just language therapy and modeling on that system. The last research article I wanted to share about effective direct instruction strategies is another meta-analysis that looked at what instructional strategies were most effective in teaching AAC. So in this study, they looked at 15 different studies and identified these 4 different effective instructional strategies. I'm going to go through each one because I'm not sure they're exactly obvious just from this list. So the first one is aided AAC modeling, which we have talked about already. So it's just using a system and modeling language on it. So pointing and touching the symbols as you talk. So like I said, that by itself or with other things has been shown really to be effective. The second one is narrative-based interventions, which just means using AAC modeling and language elicitation techniques within a narrative routine using picture books. So if you watched Marisha's talk on narratives earlier this week, you'll have a ton of ideas on how to make that happen. It's going to look really similar for AAC users. If not, if you haven't seen that, just imagine the last example where we used a car and a ramp, but you're using a picture book. The third one is an eclectic approach, which was said to be effective, and they define that as creating communication opportunities, providing modeling, and using a least to most prompting hierarchy, which means you're providing the least amount of support at the beginning, like an indirect prompt, like, what do you think? And then gradually increasing as needed, and avoiding prompts like hand over hand so that we make sure communication is independent as we possibly can. And again, the eclectic approach sounds very similar to the ramp example. And the last thing was the manned model instructional strategy, which is a really jargon-filled way of saying a more structured intervention approach. And that just has therapist-led communication opportunities, and again, a hierarchy of prompts. So for example, a student might be asked to say go on their AAC system. And if they don't respond to prompts to say go, a model is provided. So that's that last manned model. So hopefully, again, this just looks really similar to what you think of when you think of AAC therapy. And hopefully it's a reminder that your therapy doesn't need to be really complicated. Just stick with what's motivating and what your students are already doing in class, and just insert your own AAC twist on it. Sorry, I went ahead too fast. I just want to read one more quote from actually this study at the bottom. I think it's a perfect reminder when thinking about direct instruction strategies. And the authors said, however, in order to be fully effective, such strategies must be embedded in interventions that reflect the complexity of interactions involving aided communication. And here's my favorite part: focused on enhancing participation rather than addressing the development of isolated skills. So to me, this means that all of our therapy needs to be focused on enhancing participation of our students using these strategies. So we need to be thinking, how can they participate in activities they're already doing more? So this is also a really great reminder that learning how to communicate is best done through the context of actual communication and less through contrived adult-directed activities that teach isolated language skills in a pull-out environment. So we'll talk more about that in a bit, but just remember to really, really dig into your knowledge about early language development when you're doing your AAC implementation, and especially when you're thinking about your direct instruction strategies. All right, now we can go on to the last prong of AAC success, and this one's a really big one. It's communication partner training. And I'm a huge advocate for communication partner training. This just means that you're training everyone who interacts with the AAC user how to do it. So that includes teachers, classmates, paras, friends, families, everyone. So just like communication partners often have unrealistic expectations for our students, like some communication partners I've seen, they assume our students will know how to use a device before it's really shown or taught to the student. I think we often do this as SLPs with communication partners too. So I think we assume that everyone will just know how to model and engage students on their devices without being shown and taught directly. And I think this sets up teams for a lot of frustration. And there have been many, many studies on communication partner training, and it's considered to be a highly effective component of AAC implementation. And this is the simple structure I try to keep in mind when I plan my trainings. It's describe, model, practice, feedback. So first I describe the strategy and I tell what it is. Then I model the strategy directly with the student, hopefully in front of the team. And then the team can practice it and get feedback on it. So obviously in the school setting, this isn't as structured as this. And I'm actually a really big fan of really incidental training. I don't do a ton of formal training. So what this looks like most days for me is that I find little wins in my therapy, and then I go to my team and directly coach them on how to get those wins themselves. I think it's really, really important when we think about communication partner training in general to stay really specific and show, don't just tell. There's an increasing amount of research that is pointing to the importance of coaching and feedback when learning a new skill. So I think it's important to avoid the trap of walking into a setting that you're rarely in, like a classroom, and saying, here's what I want you to try, and just leaving. So overall, communication partner interventions were found to be highly effective. And it really, really works. So I'm just going to encourage you to really stick with it, even when it seems like it's not working or progress is slow on your trainings. And I'm going to talk a lot more about communication partner training later on with more specifics on what I teach. But first, I just want to overview the three-pronged approach once again. So these are the main areas I focus on and split my time between to make sure my AAC implementation is well-balanced and effective. So if it comes down to these three components, the question still remains, what am I telling families, or what am I training communication partners on? So I call these my communication partner foundational skills. I've also called them my AAC best practices, but they're things that I think every single person who interacts with an AAC user needs to know. and they're access, modeling, core vocabulary, and communication opportunities. So these are the 4 things I go back to again and again and again when my team or me feels stuck. These skills aren't 100% linear, but they're a really, really great way to scale back team demands and then gradually build up what you're asking everyone to do. So, and I also have just found that having these 4 steps, it seems to reduce overwhelm and it gives the whole team something really concrete to focus on. And I also think it's a really great framework for your own therapy. And remember, for each one, as I'm training staff on it, I'm describing the strategy, modeling it, allowing others to practice, and giving feedback. So if you think back to that 80-20 rule that I talked about, I believe that these skills are the 20% of AAC therapy. So then my goal just becomes to get as many people as possible to understand as many of these concepts through communication partner training. I think your progress will be multiplied when it's not just you working on AAC, and it makes your job a lot easier when everyone on the team understands these skills. So let's say we see a student for 3 hours a week, which is a significant amount of service time in the schools. They're seeing probably some of their paraprofessionals more than 6 hours a day, and probably same as their parents. So all of the progress is going to be multiplied in like that 80-20 rule when we start expanding our knowledge beyond just us in our therapy room. So I'm going to go through each of these one at a time and share more information on each one. But first, I just want to talk about service delivery, especially in the schools, because I know you might be wondering how I do this or how this fits into therapy in the schools. So first, when many SLPs think about training communication partners, I think they jump to doing like a whole training day or a whole training for their staff or team, like a formal training where everyone comes and the SLP stands up front and delivers information. And this can be really effective and really helpful, but I also am just going to recommend that you readjust how you think about your AAC therapy too. For me, to make all of these things happen, I had to switch up the services I provided to my AAC users. So I've been in 2 different districts as far as my school-based placements have gone. At the first school, I'll say about 75% at least of my services for AAC users was one-on-one or in small groups in a pull-out environment. My second school and district I worked for, I would say more than 75% of my services for AAC users were in class. So not in a pull-out environment. And I saw a huge, huge difference in these 2 service delivery models, the second one being a lot more effective. So in the last few years, I rarely, if ever, saw students working on learning AAC systems in a one-on-one environment. If I'm with them, somebody else is usually with them. So I'm not necessarily scheduled into their day. And if I am, I try not to be scheduled into their day for every session so that at least a couple of times a week, I'm interacting with my AAC users in front of other people. And I think this is really important time because I'm modeling what supporting communication looks like for my most complex students. And I really fight for this time. I've had to change my schedule around to make it happen, to find a good time, but to me, this is a really big priority. And I just want to also say that this doesn't mean all of my therapy is in the general education environment. If they're in a special education reading class, I want to be in there. If they work one-on-one with a para in their own room, I also want to be in there. So I just want to support them in whatever environments they're already in. And this allows me to problem solve communication challenges for my students in real time and in their most naturalistic environment, wherever that is. And that way there's always staff and peers around that I can coach and model in front of. I think communication is inherently really messy. And I think sometimes when we go into a classroom and we tell people to try something, but we're not in there, we don't understand maybe how messy it can be. So I want everyone to see what this all looks like in reality. So before I dig into all of these skills, both today and in my training with communication partners, everyone on the team needs to get familiar with the AAC system and get hands-on. So I always like to start by physically giving team members the device and letting them play around with it. So during this time, I ask really functional, open-ended questions like, What would you say on the system if you were thirsty and you wanted a drink? Or what would you say if you thought something was funny? Or if you were really excited about something? And I let everyone explore the device and also notice like little technical things, like if there's any color coding. I want their attention brought to it because it helps you understand the device, right? I let them notice things like navigation buttons, how you can tell the difference between a button and a folder in high-tech devices. How can you search for words? Is that possible? And if so, how do you do it? Is there a keyboard on the device? How do you access that? A lot of my teachers love using the keyboard, which is amazing for literacy activities, but they need to know how to find it. And also, are we keeping it in landscape or portrait mode, just so that motor memory aspect for our students is easier and we're not switching it around all the time on them. And I think this time, just to explore the system is really important before beginning all the other implementation steps, because everyone feels a lot more comfortable and you have a lot more buy-in on the future trainings you're going to do. Most high-tech AAC devices have options online for exploring the system, so you also shouldn't need your student's specific device or to take the device away from the student in order to do this. And I also want to mention, I hear so many people that the tech or getting familiar with all these different devices and apps can be really intimidating. I totally understand. My advice here is to take the pressure off of yourself. You do not need to be an expert on every single device and app. You can learn alongside your students. You can model what it looks like to not know where a button is, and just remind yourself that all of this tech can be figured out. So you can Google solutions. You can actually reach out to some of the developers and app people directly. A lot of them have amazing websites with tech tutorials. You can even post in Facebook groups to help you with the tech side of things. The most important thing is that you don't let the fear of the tech stop you from implementing the device and following the other steps. Get the time to explore it, but realize you're not going to be proficient, especially if you have to learn multiple apps and devices at the same time. You're not going to be proficient right away. So just keep pushing on and do the other parts we're going to discuss now. So now I'm going to talk about the 4 skill areas and talk more about each one and how I personally make them happen in a school-based setting. So most research and discussion of AAC implementation seems to skip straight to modeling, but I like to start at the most basic skill of all, which is access. All the other skills that I'm going to talk about rely on having access to the AAC system. So access means that an AAC system is with the student and accessible at all times. So to work on access, I've even written goals for students to transport and transition with their AAC system themselves. To me, this increases the likelihood that it will stay with them, and it also encourages them to take ownership over their device. One thing I do not want to do in this presentation is to minimize the difficulty of access. For some of our students, access is really hard. I've seen way too many things online that minimize this and say, like, how hard is it to keep the device with them? And honestly, for many of our students, it's really hard. It's really tricky, and it involves a lot of effort from everyone. So I've talked to many families, and I'd say many families or most families also report that consistent access is really hard for them. Even parents that are incredibly successful with their child's AAC systems overwhelmingly report that it takes a significant amount of effort to provide access all of the time. They have to be responsible for keeping it charged and not broken and bringing it everywhere, remembering to take it out, remembering to model on it every time they're with their child. And that can be a lot to manage. I've actually subbed in my previous district as a paraprofessional. And I remember one day I was assigned a student with complex communication needs, and I struggled in remembering the device and consistently modeling on it all day, which I found to be a very eye-opening experience. And I realized there's so many other things that these staff members have to be thinking about, and it can be really hard. I found that personally directly focusing on how we can get the device or the system in all settings is critical. So things like reminders, posters, visuals around the room. You can set buzzers on things like Apple Watches, straps so the student can carry it, and different carrying cases. And also just having a really specific plan for different scenarios goes a really long way. There was another study that I really enjoyed reading, and they went into classrooms to specifically look at AAC barriers, and access was still the #1 barrier they cited. So in this study specifically, they cited several barriers related to access, including devices being left at home, put onto counters, and left on desks during circle time. And maybe that sounds familiar to you. It sounds familiar to me. And so I think it's important to remember that while access seems so simple, it's still a huge barrier and needs to be focused on really directly. For me personally, when a student of mine gets a device, all we do at the beginning is practice taking it from class to class, from the floor to the desk, from room to room, from the bathroom to lunch, everywhere. And I try not to put pressure on anything else, although I always say to keep the device on and accessible in case a student wants to use it, but we just focus on access. During this time, I'm really active in the problem-solving process. I've been known to run home and grab bags that I've gotten at ASHA to act as a temporary carrying solution. I'm also creating backup systems for certain situations. So we figure out as a team how we can provide access all day, at all times, and in all environments, no matter what. So during this time, we also have to problem solve a lot of scenarios. So like how we handle student behaviors, or how a student can communicate in certain activities like swimming. Low-tech versions of high-tech devices can work really well for this. And honestly, most proficient AAC users that I've seen or met, they use multiple systems kind of fluidly, depending on the situation. So I think it's important to have all of these systems available for students depending on the situation and maybe any student behaviors or things you might see. And again, all of the access issues are so much easier to solve if you're right in the trenches with your team, so you can kind of problem solve and model how to make it work in real time in the classroom. And just remember that the same challenges with access exist with families too. So before I move on to the other foundational skills, just remember that access might be your biggest hurdle. And I don't want you to give up on access, and I want you to really focus on problem solving your way through different scenarios for your students, because access is so important. I also want to mention here that if you printed the slides, you might have seen, but I had so much to share with you today. And as fast as I can possibly talk, I still did not have time for everything. And I had a lot more to share on these 4 skills in particular. So I ended up moving some of the slides to the end of my presentation because I still wanted to include them. And I put specific implementation ideas and ideas for collecting data for all 4 of these skills on those slides at the end. If I have a second at the end, I'll try to breeze through them, but if not, please look at those. And if your team is struggling with access, or you're struggling with getting devices and systems out and used, this should probably be your 20% from this presentation. And you should probably start just problem solving all of these specific scenarios, because this will make a huge impact on your AAC implementation success. So after we have the habit of bringing the AAC system with us at all times, it's time to dig into the most powerful AAC teaching strategy, and that is modeling, or aided language stimulation, or aided language input. So I prefer the term modeling. I just think it's easiest to understand for families and whole teams. So I'll probably use the word modeling throughout from here on out. So one way that I like to think about modeling is if you wanted to learn a different language, what's the best thing you could do? And it's immersion. You would be around people who are speaking the language and who speak it well. If you want to teach a baby to understand and use language, what's the best thing you could do? It's to talk to the baby, and to talk to the baby for a whole year and immerse her in a really language-rich environment. So if you want a student to learn an AAC system, the best thing you can do is, again, immerse them in it. AAC users need to see and hear AAC being spoken and used in order to learn how to do it themselves. So you can use the device itself if students are comfortable with that, or you can also use a copy to model how to talk using the AAC system. Sort of all of these 4 skills, modeling is the one that has the most research and support behind it. So we should definitely be focusing our efforts on getting the team to model on the device as much as possible. The important thing to remember for modeling is that we're not expecting a response from the student, and you should just keep going with modeling even if it seems like attention is limited. One phrase that I use a lot is model and move on, so that I just model and then like I did with go, I said, do you want it to go? If they don't respond, I just make the car go and I say go, so you model and move on with the interaction. We're not testing students with modeling. We're not demanding a response or using hand over hand to get that response. So the phrase model and move on kind of reminds me to do that. So that helps me avoid testing with phrases like tell me on your talker or where's the word juice on your device. We're just modeling and providing a lot of exposure. So we need to provide access to consistent, robust language and modeling and support for many, many years for our AAC users before we jump to any conclusions about their ability to learn language. We give babies years of modeling before we expect them to talk clearly or to have a grasp of language. And I think our AAC users need and deserve the same opportunity. The third skill area is core vocabulary. I think we really need a healthy mix of vocabulary types on AAC systems, but I'll just say that personally, most of my modeling and teaching is using core vocabulary and personal core vocabulary. So first, I prioritize core vocabulary words, and those are words that are frequently used and common words. So they include words like go, like, stop, want, that, or on. This board that I'm modeling on is all core vocabulary. And you might have seen lots of core vocabulary words. So core vocabulary is really flexible, it's really versatile, and you can use it pretty much anywhere or anytime. So think about all the places you could use the word go, like go away, I want to go, and so on. I also include lots of teaching on personal core words, and I call personal core words to me are just common words, but for a specific student. So while words like go are used across people, personal core words are things like my favorite people or places or things or favorite activities. So I talk about them a lot, but maybe everyone else doesn't. And the last type of vocabulary is fringe vocabulary. And those are just mostly things like random nouns like volcano, mouse, fraction, or crayon. Things you might see on an activity-specific AAC board, which is a conversation for another day, but I just want to say those are not a terribly effective way to teach AAC. So I rarely teach these fringe vocabulary words or model fringe vocabulary words unless the student is more advanced. So teaching your whole team the concept of core is so helpful. It reduces the need for constant programming and lets you work smarter and not harder, which is my favorite thing. It'll hopefully save you time by reducing the number of times your team asks you, can you add this whole list of vocabulary into the device? And then you go and you make a new folder and you put all of the words in it, right? That's really overwhelming for students. So focusing on core helps students too. They can do so much while learning fewer words. And core vocabulary also allows you to focus on a smaller pool of words instead of just teaching different ones every class or every unit. So it can also be incorporated throughout the entire school day and even at home. And my top ones to start, if you're going to just start with 3, are go, like, and stop are all done. But I always try to start with ones that are the most motivating for students. Go to me is just one of the favorites because you can do it with favorite toys, even like light up things or electronic things work really well with the word go. And the last critical communication partner skill is creating communication opportunities. And this one puts all of the skills together. So remember earlier we talked about direct instruction strategies, and I mentioned that the point is always increased participation. So when we start focusing on communication opportunities, it's the time when we get to focus on when and how our students will participate. So communication opportunities are times of the day when an AAC user is given an opportunity to interact and participate meaningfully using their AAC system. Research has shown that AAC users need at least 200 communication opportunities every day. And I know that number, when I initially say it to people who haven't heard it before, it seems like a lot, but just think about how many opportunities typical verbal speakers have to speak in a day. And if you think back to the baby analogy or how long it takes a typically developing baby to learn how to use language, or how long it takes a typically developing adult to learn a new language, you can start to see that if an AAC user isn't getting as many opportunities to hear and practice the language, it's only going to take longer. So I try to teach my teams about different functions of communication here. Because I think if you're going to get 200 opportunities a day, that you need to be giving your student opportunities to do so many functions, like complaining or asking for things, telling stories, getting attention. I love teaching the word look for look at me, building relationships with others. And there's so many functions, but the point is just that you're thinking more broadly and beyond just learning how to ask for things. So if you assume a student's awake for 16 hours of the day, that means you need more than 12 opportunities to use the device with other people every waking hour of every day. So get your team on board with, again, really specific communication opportunities. One thing I like to do is work with my students in class and get an answer in the message window so they can raise their hand and get called on, and it's all ready to go. But just plan out times in their day where they'll be given the opportunity to communicate meaningfully. And again, having time with your students within their classes and activities make this so much easier. Another idea I talk about in my AAC Implementation Toolkit is doing monthly challenges aimed at these 4 specific skills. So for access, your challenge might be to reduce the prompts that you need to give to a student to transition with their own device. And you do that for a month. And then if you're targeting core vocabulary, you could problem solve with your team about what core words they could model for specific units or vocabulary words in the classroom. And if you want to target communication opportunities, you might, for a month, focus on creating 10 new opportunities for your student to use their device in their classroom. And just a quick reminder to include peers. I feel like I'm running low on time, but you should look into this stay, play, and talk curriculum. They taught kids to stay, play, and talk with their friends, which just meant sit close to them, take turns, look at them, touch the buttons on their system and talk to them. And the students with autism that interacted with these trained peers communicated more and showed more balanced of responses. And these improvements also generalized to new settings and untrained peers. So you could follow that study. I think that framework is really great. I've also just had a lot of success following or teaching my students those 4 skills we just went over: access, modeling, core, and communication opportunities, and just saying it in really child-friendly language. So for access, I say something like, Shannon always needs her words near her. Or modeling, I might say, just talk to Shannon using the buttons. That helps her understand. So I'm getting students involved with these 4 skills as well. Anecdotally, I've had a ton of success with peers, especially in making sure the device is out and being modeled on. So access and modeling to me are the 2 skills that peers are just amazing at. So an example would be, I've seen students when they all huddle up for circle time and the device is on the desk, peers are almost always the first ones to notice that and be comfortable standing up, going, grabbing the device and giving it to the student and sitting down. So whatever program you do, whatever you do, just remember that peers should always be included when you think of communication partner training, even if it's just really informal comments that you make to peers about how they can interact with AAC users. So just as a reminder, these are the 4 critical communication partner skills that you should be teaching, supporting, and tracking across environments. So there's providing consistent access, modeling on the system in all environments, emphasizing and teaching core vocabulary, and creating communication opportunities every single hour of every single day. These are the things, again, I said I go back to and I emphasize again and again and again. I'm no longer reinventing the wheel every month. If we're stuck, we go back to these things. And I just remind myself that everything beyond this will be so much less effective without all of these foundational pieces in place. So I try so hard to focus all of my efforts, time, and resources on these skills. And if you or your team feel stuck, just go back to these things. Where are things breaking down? What can you do to help problem solve some of these things? And if you see some of these things on the computer screen right now and you're not super comfortable or knowledgeable about them, well, now you have a really direct list of things to learn about. So it feels less open-ended. Really get comfortable with these skills yourself so that you can better teach others. And remember, it's so much easier to focus on these skills when you're in a naturalistic environment. And as just a reminder, these are the 3 prongs of AAC success. And I think we just need to be thinking about all 3, not our direct instruction strategies. So involving families, training, communication partners, and focusing on our therapy. And here is what I really think is the 20% of AAC knowledge. These are the most important skills that I think make the biggest difference. And I think by teaching everyone within earshot about all of these skills, that we as the SLPs have the power to make even bigger change in the life of our AAC users. And if you're really feeling stuck, I'd recommend using a self-reflection form. This is a freebie included in the resources at the end. I'll share the link in a minute. And just ask yourself these questions, reflect on your current programming, and just to get an idea of where to go next. So this is a really, really simple form, but I think it just gets your brain kind of thinking about where things maybe are breaking down. So some really general implementation ideas is always start with engagement, focus on motivation, fun, and maybe sensory-based activities at first. Notice what the student already enjoys. You could do things like watching and talking about videos. I play the react game, which my students think is hilarious. And I basically just react to everything that they say on the AAC system in like the most dramatic, funny way. And also just remember to include peers and play. I sometimes have students come to therapy and play games with us. Keeps it really fun and really low pressure. And it teaches them that their device can be used to build relationships, which is, again, the whole point of that increased participation. Once they're comfortable doing those types of activities, you can build up to doing activities with increased academic demands as they gain skills and confidence. One thing I want to mention here is that I think it's really best to avoid doing implementation strategies like a core word of the week. I hear about this so much as it's the most common thing that I hear about, but I think it can actually be really, really harmful until your team really understands modeling and how to create low pressure communication opportunities. I've heard of so many situations where a word of the week is inappropriately implemented, and it's where communication gets dwindled down into things like matching AAC symbols, and our students begin to see their devices as an academic demand. They're forced to say go during the activity. Often the device only appears on their desk when it's time to do something structured and academic. So be really careful to avoid that. And this harms you too, because you're stuck in the cycle of making weekly materials that are possibly being implemented in an inappropriate way. So just don't tell your team what to do before they know how and why. And as a reminder, check the slides later on for more specific implementation ideas. These are 5 resources I think you should know about. The first one has training modules and the most fabulous low tech boards, including ones for low vision students. The next 3 are my favorite places to get materials and ideas for therapy. And the last one is my AAC Implementation Toolkit, which focuses on team training and education. So my AAC Toolkit gives you everything that you need to provide communication partner training on all the skills that I went through in this presentation. So familiarizing yourself with the system, access, modeling, core, and creating communication opportunities. It's gotten some really, really amazing feedback, which I appreciate so much, from other SLPs who are using it to train families, teachers, paras, and even entire school districts. So definitely check it out if you're looking for a shortcut to make some of the training parts easier. And just as a quick summary, this is what we covered today. The top 3 areas are the primary areas you should be focusing on as you lead implementation, and the bottom ones are the most critical skills for you and everyone else who interacts with an AAC user to know. So just think about what your 20% is, what's the takeaway you think will make the biggest impact, what's something you could try in the next month. My guess is for a lot of you that your 20% might be doing communication partner training, or maybe digging in on problem solving some issues related to access or modeling, or even just sending home a vocabulary questionnaire to better involve families. So I hope this visual helps you feel like AAC implementation is less nebulous and less overwhelming. I know when I dwindle things down to something that can fit on one page, it often feels like I'm not spinning my wheels or going in a million different directions. And most importantly, keep going. I know school systems can be messy. I love the schools, it's my favorite work setting, but we're working in really highly imperfect systems. So just remember that your work is still so important. You're making such a difference for the life of your students. So keep going. And thank you. The link right there, speechymusings.com/SLP Summit, has the free checklist with the 3 areas, the vocabulary questionnaire, links to my favorite resources. And again, I shared implementation ideas for all of the areas, including a data collection ideas at the end here. I knew I was going to run out of time. And then all of the references are here as well. So I don't know if we have a ton of time for Q&A. I meant to do one. Sorry, you guys. I talked as fast as I could.
Shannon, can we be you when we grow up?
Yes, I want to be you when we grow up. So
oh my God. Yes, you can. Seriously, it was so good. Oh my gosh. Thank you for sharing that with the knowledge. I mean, beyond the knowledge and everything we just learned too, the way you just put that presentation together. Like, I think for the first time in my life, I'm like getting AAC and like thinking I can actually go out there and do something. So it was beautifully done from start to finish. And we really, really appreciate you.
Thank you both. I'm so happy to do this after a long time.
Yes.
We do have several questions for you, but what I want to do is go ahead and officially close the course. So anybody that feels like they don't have time for the Q&A, they are released, because this will be the end of the course officially, where if you are looking to earn ASHA CEUs, you have attended the full course, just make sure you pay that fee, do your feedback, pass the quiz, and then also do that opt-in step, and then you will be eligible to earn ASHA CEUs as long as you meet that deadline date of January 31st. And but let's get to the Q&A, because that's the cool
before
stuff.
that too. I hope you guys know this with the giveaways.
Oh, yes, giveaways.
Shannon, you're going to give. Sometimes we do like Amazon gift cards, but you're giving away some of your products, right?
Yes, I was going to give away 3 copies of the digital version of the AAC Toolkit. So it has core boards, the whole training module, and a PowerPoint presentation that you can use for staff.
Awesome. So
Yeah.
3 of you are going to win. We will just randomly select from anybody who attended this live course, and you will get an email if you're the lucky winner. So look for that in the next few days. And okay, so here are a couple of the questions. If you guys want to stick around for answers, Shannon, there's a couple in here too. If we don't get to them, then we'll send them to you. And if you want to address them like in an email or something, that works.
Yeah,
Yep.
Facebook Live, a blog post, whatever. We'll just pick like maybe 3 of these, and then we'll send you the list of all the questions.
Perfect.
This
That would be
is
great.
a great one, I think, because I've experienced this myself. What if you have a student that has multiple disabilities and they love their device, but just to kind of play on it and they don't use it for anything kind of for purposeful communication?
They like the sound.
Right.
Yeah.
They just like to push the buttons and play with it. What is your advice in that situation?
Yeah. So it really can be pretty student specific. I've done all sorts of different things for this, but one of them is sometimes I give my students time to do that. So I might set a timer and give them like 30 minutes. Typical children babble for a very long time before they come out with meaningful words. So I like to think of that time as like exploring and babbling time. Obviously, with some of our students and their diagnoses, they're more prone to these repetitive loops that they can just get stuck in, where it becomes not productive anymore. But I find that like giving them a time, like we're gonna talk and play for 30 minutes and then we can sit quietly. Beyond that, sometimes even some devices will let you set the trigger time where you have to press and hold a button for a little longer. If they're like one of those really rapid fire kids that are like flying through all the pages really fast, it just slows them down. And the last thing, I mean, there's tons of strategies I could probably go into, but the last thing is always just treat it as if they were a verbal child. So if they're really disrupting class, then they should be given a warning and then potentially removed, or, you know, told that they need to take a break or something like that. I see those repetitive loops where they're not functional when kids are dysregulated a lot. So potentially even getting them out of the room and swinging or something could help, but hopefully that's a couple of ideas.
Yeah, for sure.
Good.
We have another question of, is it possible to successfully implement these kind of ideas for, oh my gosh, I can't speak. Is it
the last day of
possible?
Summit. So just forgive us as we fumble through it.
I can read, I promise. Is it possible to successfully implement these ideas via telepractice?
Yeah, I think so. I actually have never thought about it.
Yes, do it.
I feel like with the students you're going to be doing this with, I almost think it's probably the best, because they're never just gonna, sometimes in the schools, they just want you to like fill breaks for paras. So you have nobody with you and it's just you with the student. But in teletherapy, they can't really do that. So I'd imagine there's always a para or a facilitator with them, I almost think that would make it easier because you can focus like half of your time on therapy, and then while you're kind of doing it, interject with different communication partner training things. So I would think, yeah, it could totally be done.
Yeah, you might actually, if you have that hopefully that attention of the individuals that are supporting that student, it's kind of twofold. You're doing the training with them as well. Yeah, that's really cool.
We have another question about evaluation. So this SLP actually has touch chat on a personal iPad, but it's very old, it's very slow. She wouldn't want to use it for an evaluation. So if you are in a school setting and if you need to do an evaluation, her first question is she the most appropriate person or qualified to do an AAC evaluation? Where would she even start? How could she get a variety of materials to even do it?
That's really tricky and probably depends on your school, but I will say that I have had and I've heard a lot of SLPs have success getting free apps. If she has an iPad, she's already like, that's amazing and really helpful. If you don't have the iPad, it's harder, but you can reach out to developers. A lot of them will give SLP codes for assessment purposes only. So it's a full copy of the app, but just for the use of assessment. So I would start there by getting, if she messages me, I can give her like the top 4. And there's even links, I think Practical AAC, if you search that blog for free assessment apps, they have a list of how to contact all the different developers that I can send the link. But also assessing, like if you have no access to tech and you have to do, well, first, I mean, you need to grow your professional competency to be comfortable doing it, but students can do really well on complex low tech systems too, that have flipboards and tons of symbols. So you can do it a lot with low tech stuff too. But I would start with trying to get those free assessment copies of apps first.
Well, and actually the same person had a 2-part to her question that she was asked to do an evaluation and has never done one before. So where do you start if you don't feel comfortable because you don't have any prior background in doing assessment, you don't feel like you have the materials? What's the first starting point to get started with that?
For me, it would be, I mean, I love like research and online everything, all the blogs and everything. I would probably honestly go to Practical AAC and search the word assessment. That is the most wonderful website that just has tons of experts weighing in. If she really feels uncomfortable, I would advocate strongly with her district that she needs someone to supervise her or train her in that, because it's not something that you can always just wing. So I would really advocate against, like with your supervisor, to say someone needs to be in there, even if it's someone else just as a second set of hands. But you know, I mean, in these evals, you're juggling like 97 different things. So probably advocate with your supervisor or district for some supervision. But like if she's truly on her own, websites like Practical AAC, Project Core, I mentioned and I linked in the resources, they have like all free video modules that teach you everything you need to know about AAC implementation, including in the schools, and have free boards. So at minimum, go to Project Core or Practical AAC and get your learn on, I guess.
And I love one of the points that you made, and I have a feeling it's probably going to end up as a quote. But where you were talking about, it really is like language therapy. It's all of the same things that we're doing all the time, but there's just this device involved. And
exactly.
So that was my biggest aha, that it's output, that it's still language.
It's just the output
versus a verbal output.
Yeah. But I think when we're not modeling in that, how are students supposed to know that that's an output? You know, so it's just thinking about kind of that part of it. Yeah.
We have a million questions for you that you can either do with those what you will, but that's a wrap, Shannon.
And we hurt you very much, Shannon. Thank you so much.
Thank you, guys.
And thank you, all of you who have joined us this entire week of Summit. I cannot believe this is it.
I know, I feel like I blinked.
It has been the best week. We are so excited about every presenter that has joined us. We are excited about how amazing you guys have been and everybody who's joined us this week. And I'm actually a little sad. Normally I'm like, oh, phew. This time I'm like, I know it's over. Yeah. But anyway, there's still replays till the 26th. And we'll see you guys in the summer.
Bye.
Bye.